It was March 17, 1943, and a folder hit the mahogany desk in the heart of the Abwehr headquarters. The resounding slap echoed through the room, sending coffee splashing from Admiral Wilhelm Canaris's porcelain cup, staining intelligence reports, documents whose discovery by the Gestapo would mean certain death. The moment was impossible. The information, if accurate, would shake the foundations of the German war effort. The Americans, long dismissed by the Nazis as inefficient, were not only fighting back, they were producing at a scale beyond comprehension. The contents of the folder were not just reports. They were a warning, one that the Nazi leadership had refused to heed. A testament to the American industrial might that Germany had consistently underestimated. For years, German commanders had dismissed the United States as a paper tiger, a country too reliant on its democratic ideals and racial theories to ever sustain a prolonged war effort. The Nazis saw the U.S. as weak, inefficient, and incapable of meeting the logistical demands of global conflict. The idea that the Americans could ramp up production to support a war effort was as unfathomable as it was terrifying. But the reports before Canaris could not be ignored. They confirmed what many in the German intelligence community had long feared. America's industrial power was not only real, but it was also unmatched. The German military had long believed that American manufacturing was a myth, a story told by propagandists to fool the rest of the world. But as the evidence stacked up, the truth became undeniable. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant, located in Michigan, was producing a B-24 Liberator bomber every hour, faster than any single production facility in Germany could produce even a simple military vehicle. This plant, which had previously been thought of as just another civilian factory, was now manufacturing heavy bombers with a precision and scale that no one in Europe had ever imagined. The Americans were not just building warplanes. They were creating them on an industrial scale, churning out one of the most complex machines in the world, faster than Germany could assemble a single truck. The scale of American production had been underestimated for years, largely due to the racist and ideological convictions that permeated Nazi leadership. The idea that a country founded on democracy, populated by people from all corners of the world, could outperform the master race was a concept so alien to Nazi thinking that it was impossible for them to accept. The American workforce was diverse, made up of women, African Americans, and even children, and that diversity was seen as a weakness by German military planners. But the truth was far more complicated than the Nazi worldview would allow. Despite the constant stream of intelligence reports, the German leadership remained steadfast in their disbelief. The intelligence was there, clear and undeniable, but it was met with derision. The reports from Mexican industrialists, intercepted letters, and even the occasional diplomatic source, whether Swedish, Spanish, or Argentine, told the same story. The Americans were producing bombers at a rate that far outpaced Germany's ability to defend itself. Yet German officials like Hermann Göring, who mocked the very idea that the United States could build bombers, refused to accept this reality. To acknowledge it would mean acknowledging a fundamental flaw in their entire war strategy. It was a failure that began years earlier. In 1941, General Karl Kohler, head of the Luftwaffe, had presented reports from the German military attaché in Washington, indicating that American aircraft production was rapidly escalating. Göring's response was scornful. Americans, he said, were only good at making refrigerators and razors. They were not capable of producing the sophisticated war machinery needed to challenge the Nazi war machine. By March of 1943, however, the data was inescapable. The Willow Run plant was not just producing a handful of bombers. It was producing more heavy bombers every month than all of Germany's factories combined. The production numbers were staggering, 650 bombers a month. And the U.S. wasn't stopping there. The American production system was shifting to meet the needs of a global war, and it was succeeding in ways that German planners could never have anticipated. The head of German air intelligence, Nicola Ritter, had spent weeks analyzing the data. Ritter, a former Luftwaffe pilot who had spent years in the United States, had a deep understanding of American manufacturing capacity. His experience living in New York during the 1920s had given him a first-hand look at the speed and efficiency with which Americans could build. But even Ritter was stunned by the scale of the production at Willow Run. It was not just a matter of numbers, it was a matter of logistics. Every piece of the production puzzle fit together with military precision. Through covert sources, German intelligence had learned that Ford's Willow Run plant employed more than 40,000 workers, many of them women and minorities, groups that Nazi ideology considered inferior. These workers were producing complex aircraft in a manner that German intelligence had been taught was impossible. The efficiency of the assembly line, the speed with which components were made and assembled, was unmatched. No one in Europe had seen anything like it. The Americans had managed to turn their automobile manufacturing techniques into a war-winning machine. The intelligence came from all corners of the world. American oil executive Harold Morrison, while in Mexico City on a diplomatic mission, casually described the operations at Willow Run to German agents posing as Argentine businessmen. His words, written down on a napkin, painted a picture of a plant so large it could produce its own weather. The workers were efficient, working in shifts to meet the demands of war, and the plant produced more bombers than Germany could produce in a year. The reports were accurate, almost too accurate. But it wasn't just the production numbers that floored the Germans, it was the sheer scale of the operation. The U.S. was using advanced tools, methods, and an unparalleled workforce to build planes. Thousands of women, minorities, and young workers were contributing to the war effort. The assembly line was the beating heart of the American industrial machine, and it was not just efficient, it was revolutionary. German intelligence agents who visited the plant were baffled by how the Americans had perfected the assembly process. Admiral Canaris, who had always believed in the necessity of accurate intelligence, found himself at a crossroads. The data was irrefutable. The Americans were producing bombers at a pace that Germany could never hope to match. Yet the Nazi leadership, blinded by ideology and prejudice, refused to believe the facts. Even when Canaris presented photographs and reports, Göring scoffed. The idea that the United States could outproduce Germany was not just a military failure, it was an ideological one. The entire foundation of Nazi racial superiority and military doctrine was built on the idea that the U.S. could never compete with Germany. To accept the truth would have been to accept that the Nazis had been wrong all along. This was the heart of the problem. It wasn't a lack of intelligence, it was a failure to accept reality. The numbers were there, the reports were clear, but the leadership was unwilling to face the uncomfortable truth. They had underestimated the United States in a way that would cost them the war. The Germans had failed to comprehend the American industrial machine, and in doing so, they had sealed their own fate. As the war raged on, the inability of German leadership to accept the truth would come back to haunt them. The U.S. was not just capable of war, it was capable of waging war on a scale that Germany could never have imagined. And by the time the Germans realized their mistake, it was too late. The Atlantic Ocean, vast and unyielding, stretched out as a natural barrier between the United States and the heart of Europe. A seemingly impenetrable divide that the Axis powers believed would shield them from the full force of American military might. To the German High Command, the ocean was not just a body of water, it was a psychological fortress, a powerful ally in their quest to stave off the impending threat from across the sea. The idea that America, despite its size and industrial prowess, could ever truly engage in the European theater of war was, in their eyes, a fantasy. The Atlantic, they thought, was the ultimate defense, a natural obstacle too great for any enemy to overcome. In the minds of Hitler and his generals, the sheer distance between America and Europe was a fatal flaw. How could a nation so far removed from the battlefield possibly hope to project its military power onto the continent? The idea that the United States could mount a successful invasion across the Atlantic seemed absurd to the German leadership. The ocean, they believed, would not only slow down American reinforcements, but would also drain their resources and commitment, just as it had done during World War I. The Germans had witnessed the logistical nightmare that had hindered the Allied efforts in the Great War, and they assumed that history would repeat itself. The U.S. might build planes and tanks, but how could they ever transport such vast amounts of material across the treacherous expanse of the Atlantic? Hitler, driven by his own prejudices and ideological blindness, dismissed the possibility of an American victory in Europe. The Atlantic was not just a geographical feature to him. It was a symbol of everything the Nazis believed was wrong with the United States. They saw America as a nation divided by weak, inefficient politics, its people divided by race, class, and culture. In their eyes, the Americans were not capable of coordinating such an immense logistical effort, especially when faced with the daunting task of crossing the Atlantic. Hitler, convinced that the U.S. would never be able to sustain such an endeavor, underestimated the resilience of the American spirit. The German military believed that the United States was simply too disconnected from Europe to make a meaningful impact. They couldn't fathom that, despite the Atlantic Ocean, the Americans would not only find a way to send troops and resources across, but would do so with astonishing speed and efficiency. The Germans, trapped in their own worldview, misread the nature of American determination. They failed to understand that the ocean was not a barrier to the U.S. It was a challenge, yes, but one that could be overcome with ingenuity and resolve. This strategic error would have profound consequences. From the very beginning of the war, German intelligence had insisted that the U.S. would be unable to make a significant impact in Europe. They predicted that the Americans, despite their industrial power, would be bogged down in the logistics of transporting troops and supplies across the Atlantic. Even as the United States began to ramp up its war effort, sending men and material to the European front, the German leadership continued to view this as a temporary inconvenience. The ocean would slow them down, they believed, forcing them to expend resources that would ultimately lead to their downfall. But this underestimation of American resolve would prove to be the Axis's undoing. What Germany failed to recognize was the unparalleled ability of the United States to innovate and adapt in the face of overwhelming obstacles. The Atlantic Ocean, once seen as an insurmountable barrier, became the stage for a logistical revolution. The Allies, led by the United States, would develop the infrastructure, ships, and systems necessary to transport men, weapons, and supplies across that vast expanse with unprecedented speed and efficiency. As the war progressed, the Germans watched in disbelief as the United States ramped up its production and logistical capabilities, defying their expectations. The Americans not only crossed the Atlantic, but they also brought with them the full weight of their industrial capacity. The success of the American military machine was not simply a matter of having more men and more resources. It was about their ability to move those resources quickly and effectively across the ocean. From the construction of massive transport fleets to the development of new landing crafts, the United States demonstrated an unmatched ability to overcome logistical challenges. The sheer scale of the American effort would soon make the Germans realize just how badly they had misjudged the situation. The Allies' ability to maintain a constant flow of troops and supplies across the Atlantic would become one of the defining features of the war. What Germany had assumed was a natural defense, an impenetrable ocean, was, in reality, a logistical challenge that could be surmounted through determination and technological ingenuity. The turning point came with the successful invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, a bold operation that relied on the full force of American logistical power. Operation Overlord, as it was called, was the largest amphibious invasion in history, and its success hinged on the ability of the Allies to transport an overwhelming force across the Atlantic and establish a beachhead in German-occupied France. The Germans, still reeling from their earlier miscalculations, watched in horror as thousands of American soldiers poured onto the beaches of Normandy, supported by a relentless flow of supplies and reinforcements. The Atlantic, once thought to be an insurmountable obstacle, was now the route through which the tide of war would turn decisively against them. What the Axis failed to grasp was that the Americans had the capacity to operate on a global scale. The distance between the United States and Europe, which had seemed like an insurmountable hurdle, was nothing more than a logistical problem waiting to be solved. The United States' ability to produce, transport, and deploy military forces on such a scale shattered the German misconception of American weakness. The Atlantic, which had once seemed like the perfect defense, became a pathway for American power, a symbol of their ability to mobilize and respond to the needs of the war. In hindsight, the Axis's overestimation of the ocean as a barrier to American power was a fatal flaw. The Germans misread the nature of American resilience, believing that the logistical challenges posed by the Atlantic would be enough to slow the U.S. war effort. But the United States, with its boundless industrial capacity and ingenuity, turned the ocean from a defensive advantage for the Axis into the very means by which they would secure victory. The Allies' ability to breach the Atlantic barrier and establish a foothold in Europe was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. A miscalculation of monumental proportions, one that would contribute directly to their downfall. In the final months of the war, as the Allies flooded the continent with troops, planes, tanks, and supplies, the Germans were forced to confront the reality that their belief in the Atlantic as a defense had been not just misguided, but catastrophic. The ocean had not kept the Americans at bay. Instead, it had been a challenge they had met head-on, using every ounce of their industrial might and innovation. The Germans, meanwhile, found themselves helpless in the face of an unstoppable force, a force made possible by the very thing they had dismissed as a weakness, the might of the American logistical machine. When the United States entered World War II, it did not merely join the conflict. It transformed itself into an industrial juggernaut whose power would reshape the entire course of the war. The German High Command, blinded by their own misconceptions and racial ideologies, failed to grasp just how potent the American industrial machine would become. They underestimated the sheer scale of American production, convinced that even if the United States could muster the manpower, it could never match the speed, efficiency, and volume of Germany's manufacturing might. What they failed to realize was that the United States had something the Axis did not: an unrivaled ability to innovate, adapt, and mobilize its resources at a scale that no other nation had ever seen. The American industrial effort would become a force unlike any other, and it would tip the balance of the war in favor of the Allies. The foundation of this incredible production power was laid long before the first shots of World War II were fired. By the time the United States formally entered the conflict, its industrial base was already vast, capable of producing everything from automobiles to consumer goods. But once war was declared, the U.S. swiftly transitioned from peacetime production to a wartime economy. It was a transformation that took less than a year. In what was essentially a national reorganization, factories were retooled, assembly lines were re-engineered, and civilian production facilities were converted to churn out military equipment. America's factories began producing war material at a rate that stunned the world, and more importantly, it stunned Germany. The Germans, used to a highly efficient, albeit tightly controlled industrial base, could not fathom how the Americans could achieve such a feat. By 1942, just a year after entering the war, American factories were already producing thousands of military vehicles, ships, and planes. The United States alone would end up producing more than 300,000 aircraft during the war, as well as tens of thousands of tanks, trucks, and other armored vehicles. The sheer numbers were unprecedented. The Willow Run plant, as previously mentioned, alone produced over 8,000 B-24 Liberator bombers, churning them out at a rate of 1 per hour. And this was just one of countless facilities working around the clock to meet the war's demands. The American war machine was not just large, it was unrelenting. But it wasn't just the number of weapons that mattered, it was their quality and effectiveness. The United States didn't just build a large quantity of tanks or planes, it built a diverse arsenal capable of fighting on multiple fronts. From heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress to the nimble P-51 Mustang fighter, from the massive M4 Sherman tank to the amphibious landing craft that would storm the beaches of Normandy, the variety and, specialization of American production were unmatched. Each weapon was designed for a specific purpose, and each factory was optimized to produce these machines with military precision. What Germany failed to understand was not just how many weapons America could produce, but how quickly it could turn out sophisticated military technology. This versatility, this ability to scale up production across every facet of warfare, would prove to be one of the deciding factors in the Allied victory. A key aspect of American production power was the sheer number of workers mobilized to support the war effort. In stark contrast to the German reliance on a highly specialized workforce, the United States opened its doors to a wide swath of the population. Women, African Americans, and even children became an essential part of the workforce in factories across the nation. The most famous symbol of this new workforce was Rosie the Riveter, the icon of the American woman who stepped into factories, rivet gun in hand, to produce the armaments that would change the course of the war. Women made up nearly 40% of the workforce in war factories, a contribution that was as crucial as it was revolutionary. This mass mobilization of workers did more than just fill factory jobs. It helped redefine the very notion of production. The United States, with its diverse population, proved that labor was not limited to any one group. African Americans, who had long been excluded from certain industries, were now crucial to the war effort, with thousands working in manufacturing plants, serving in the military, and contributing to the war economy. The expansion of the workforce to include women and minority groups was not just a necessity born of war, it was a testament to the resilience and adaptability of American society. And it was this diversity of labor that enabled American factories to meet the unrelenting demands of war. But the real key to American success was its ability to innovate. While Germany was still relying on many of its pre-war manufacturing methods, the United States revolutionized industrial processes to meet the needs of war. The famous assembly lines that produce cars and trucks for the civilian market were retooled to produce military equipment at an astonishing pace. What had once been a tool for making consumer goods was now the backbone of a global war effort. But it wasn't just about speed, it was about efficiency. Each factory used mass production techniques to streamline the creation of war materials, minimizing errors and cutting down production time. This was industrialization, on a scale that had never been seen before. The American logistical network that supported this production was just as remarkable. The United States didn't simply build planes and tanks, it had the infrastructure in place to get them where they were needed. The transportation system, railways, highways, and ships, was expanded and optimized to move massive quantities of war material across the country and ultimately to the front lines in Europe and the Pacific. The Germans, still relying on their traditional rail and road networks, couldn't match the Americans' ability to move supplies over vast distances. The United States also perfected the art of amphibious warfare, developing landing crafts that could bring soldiers and equipment directly to enemy shores. This was a new kind of warfare, one that could project American power onto distant beaches, forests, and fields, no matter how far from home. But the Germans still couldn't comprehend the full scope of the American industrial machine. They watched as American war production ramped up, but they didn't understand how the U.S. was managing it. German intelligence, despite its best efforts, couldn't grasp the scale of what the Americans were doing. Even when they intercepted reports and photographs from spies in neutral countries, they simply couldn't believe what they were seeing. The numbers didn't make sense to them. How could America, a country so far removed from the conflict, produce more tanks, planes, and weapons than the entire Axis combined? It seemed impossible. What the Germans failed to see was that this wasn't just about raw materials. It was about a national resolve, a commitment to victory that transcended everything else. The U.S. didn't just have factories and raw materials. It had the will to win, to turn its economy into a war machine. The transition from civilian production to military production was not just an economic shift. It was a cultural one. The United States' capacity to produce war materials was not just a matter of having the right factories. It was about having the right people, the right vision, and the right infrastructure in place to make it happen. The result was staggering. By the end of the war, the United States had produced more than 88,000 tanks, 300,000 aircraft, and 12 million rifles, numbers that were simply unthinkable in the years before the war. This output wasn't just important, it was transformative. It meant that the United States could fight a two-ocean war, supporting campaigns in both Europe and the Pacific without ever running out of resources or materials. The Germans, struggling to meet the demands of their own military, could not compete with this sheer industrial force. The scale of American production was a force unlike any other, and it was a key factor in the Allied victory. The Germans had simply failed to understand the full capacity of the American war machine. They underestimated America's ability to turn its vast industrial base into an unstoppable force, one capable of sustaining a global war effort. The United States did not just win the war with its armies, it won the war with its factories, its workers, and its unyielding industrial power. This was a lesson the Germans would never live to learn fully. By the time they realized their mistake, it was already too late. The American production machine had already changed the tide of history. As the war raged on, the tides of battle began to shift, and one of the most unexpected outcomes of the Allied victory was the arrival of German prisoners of war on American soil. These soldiers, who had once viewed the United States as little more than a distant, unimportant power, were about to experience a first-hand lesson in the staggering scale of American industrial might, and how their previous assumptions had been completely wrong. For many, the transition from enemy soldier to American prisoner was a profound shock, not just because of the circumstances, but because it revealed a side of the United States they had never anticipated, one of unimaginable strength, abundance, and, perhaps most striking of all, a way of life that seemed almost beyond belief. When German soldiers first found themselves in American captivity, their initial reactions were a mixture of skepticism and mockery. Many had been taught to believe that the United States was a weak and disorganized nation, incapable of sustaining a prolonged war effort. They had been told that America's vast size made it unmanageable, that its democracy was a crumbling system, and that the country's racial and social divisions would be its undoing. They had been led to believe that, despite its industrial power, the United States could never hope to keep pace with the military efficiency and unity of Nazi Germany. And yet, as they were transported across the ocean and placed in prison camps in the heart of the U.S., the reality of American logistics and wartime capabilities began to dawn on them in ways they could never have imagined. At first, there was little that would suggest the awe that would later emerge from the German POWs. The prison camps were just that, places of confinement and surveillance, but soon it was the small luxuries that began to catch the attention of these soldiers. Things that seemed trivial yet represented the vast difference in the material conditions between their own war-torn country and the booming industrial powerhouse they had once underestimated. One of the first things they encountered was ice cream. To these men, accustomed to the hardships of war and the dire shortages of their homeland, the mere idea of frozen cream, sweet and cold, was nothing short of miraculous. Ice cream was a treat they had never imagined could be so plentiful, so abundant, and so readily available. In Germany, such luxuries were long gone, replaced by rationing and deprivation. But in the United States, it seemed that these comforts were endless, offered to them as if they were commonplace. And then there was Coca-Cola. A simple drink, perhaps, but to the German prisoners it was an emblem of the American way of life, something they had never fully appreciated or understood. Coca-Cola wasn't just a soda. It was a symbol of a thriving, prosperous country. The prisoners, used to the bitterness of war, tasted something in the sweetness of the drink that was entirely new. A sense of luxury, a feeling of being far removed from the harshness they had left behind in Europe. They had expected their American captors to be brutish and disorganized, yet the opposite was true. The Americans, with their well-fed prisoners, their abundance of goods, and their welcoming demeanor, seemed like a different kind of power altogether. The simple act of drinking a Coke, sitting in a well-maintained camp, was a far cry from the ravages of war they had known. As time went on, this initial surprise began to grow into something more profound. The German soldiers who had once scoffed at the idea of American military might began to witness something they had never imagined. It wasn't just the luxuries they enjoyed, but the sheer scale of American production that began to leave them in awe. These were men who had fought on the battlefields of Europe, who had faced off against the Allies with everything the Nazi war machine could muster. Yet as they moved through the United States, whether it was through the supply convoys they saw firsthand or the conversations they had with their captors, the prisoners began to understand the true scale of America's industrial strength. They saw, for instance, the vast network of railroads crisscrossing the country, transporting not just men, but tanks, trucks, and planes. They were brought to factories where the assembly lines stretched out for miles, each one dedicated to the production of a different piece of war machinery. In one factory, they saw workers, men and women, assembling trucks and tanks with mechanical precision. In another, they watched as massive machines churned out parts for aircraft, each piece coming together in a well-coordinated dance that seemed almost too efficient to be real. The German soldiers, who had spent years fighting with the best that their own factories could offer, were stunned by the sight of America's ability to scale up production, to churn out war materials at a rate that Germany could never match. They were also struck by the size and efficiency of the American workforce. Where German factories relied on highly trained specialists, the United States seemed to draw on the vast pool of its population. Women, African Americans, and young men all worked side by side, producing war material at an astonishing rate. It was a workforce that, in their minds, could never have been possible. How could a country with such diversity, a country that they had been taught to believe was weak and fragmented, produce this much? How could a country that seemed so divided manage to harness the full power of its people for a single cause? As the months passed, the skepticism of the German POWs began to turn into something approaching respect, if not admiration. They realized that they had underestimated the United States on a scale far beyond what they had imagined. The vast Atlantic Ocean, once seen as the ultimate defensive barrier, had not kept the U.S. at bay. Instead, the American industrial machine had powered through it, bringing the full force of the nation's economic might to the war effort. The soldiers, many of whom had been convinced that the U.S. would never be able to sustain a meaningful war effort, were now seeing firsthand the incredible scale of American logistics. They had been wrong in every way, and they knew it. The irony, of course, was not lost on them. The very men who had once mocked the idea of an American victory were now witnessing the reality of that victory in ways they could not have imagined. They were now living proof that the United States had not only the material power to win the war, but also the ingenuity and resolve to mobilize that power on a global scale. The prisoners, who had once laughed at the idea of American supremacy, now stood as witnesses to it, unable to deny the truth of what they saw. As the war drew to a close, these German prisoners would return home, their perspectives forever changed. Some would never speak of what they had seen in the United States. Others would quietly admit, in private moments, that the myth of American weakness had been shattered, that the United States had, in fact, become the decisive force in the war. For them, the journey from battlefield to prison camp had been one of humbling revelation. They had entered American captivity believing in the superiority of the Nazi war machine, but they left with a new understanding. America's power, born from its industrial might, had proven to be unstoppable. For the United States, the arrival of German prisoners was a moment of quiet triumph. It was a reminder that the true strength of a nation is not just in its military or its leaders, but in its ability to harness its people, its resources, and its ingenuity to win on a global scale. And in that sense, the prisoners who once scoffed at the idea of American power became unwitting witnesses to the triumph of the American industrial engine, a force unlike any other the world had ever seen. For the German soldiers, arriving in American prison camps was not just a physical defeat, it was a psychological shock. To these men, who had been conditioned by years of Nazi propaganda to view the United States as a weak and disorganized country, the experience was nothing short of revelatory. They had been taught to believe that America's vast size, its political system, and its social divisions were all signs of inherent weakness. In their minds, the U.S. was incapable of sustaining the kind of focused, unified war effort that Germany could. But the moment they encountered the small luxuries of American life, simple comforts like ice cream and Coca-Cola, they began to realize how thoroughly they had misjudged the situation. These seemingly trivial indulgences were, in fact, symbols of a far more significant reality: the immense resources at the United States' disposal and the extraordinary logistical and industrial strength that no Axis power had foreseen. It began with the ice cream. To many of the German prisoners, the idea of eating ice cream was a fantasy, a luxury they had long since resigned themselves to never experiencing again. In the chaos of war, especially after years of rationing, ice cream had become a distant memory, something reserved for the privileged few. But here, in American prison camps, it was a common treat. Soldiers who had once fought in the frozen landscapes of Russia or the burning deserts of North Africa, who had been deprived of the comforts of civilian life, found themselves staring in disbelief at a simple bowl of ice cream. It wasn't just the cold, sweet taste that stunned them. It was the very availability of it. In their minds, such an indulgence could only exist in a world of abundance, one that was far beyond anything they had imagined. Ice cream, in all its simplicity, became a symbol of something much larger: the incredible resources that the United States could afford to lavish on its soldiers and prisoners alike. The Germans, whose own people were subsisting on starvation rations, couldn't fathom how a nation so far removed from the battlefields could be so prosperous. For them, this was not just a dessert. It was proof that America had the means to provide for its people in ways that Germany simply could not match. It was the first crack in their belief that the U.S. was a disjointed, weak power. The sight of American troops enjoying ice cream, the knowledge that their captors had such luxuries at their disposal, began to chip away at the Germans' preconceived notions about the United States. This was not a country in decline. This was a nation that could produce, sustain, and thrive, even in the midst of global conflict. But it wasn't just the ice cream that began to shift their worldview. It was the Coca-Cola. To the German prisoners, this was even more symbolic. Coca-Cola was more than just a drink. It was the epitome of American consumer culture, a refreshingly simple beverage. It had become, over time, a symbol of America's industrial and cultural dominance. For the Germans, who had been taught to view the United States as a fragmented society, Coca-Cola represented a unified force. It was a product of a nation that could manufacture not just weapons and war materials, but also the most popular drink in the world. In the eyes of the prisoners, Coca-Cola was a testament to the power of American industry, the ability to take something as simple as flavored soda and turn it into a global commodity, distributed across the world. When they were first introduced to Coca-Cola, many of the German soldiers were bewildered. It was sweet, fizzy, and unlike anything they had ever tasted. But as they drank it, they began to understand what it represented. Coca-Cola wasn't just a drink. It was a symbol of American ingenuity and its ability to create and mass-produce goods on a scale that no one else could match. In Nazi Germany, consumer goods had long been rationed, and even the most basic comforts were considered luxuries. But in America, not only could civilians indulge in such products, but they were also distributed widely across the country, even to prisoners of war. The Germans couldn't ignore the fact that Coca-Cola represented something far greater than just a sweet drink. It represented a nation that could produce with limitless capacity. What these simple luxuries revealed to the German POWs was the magnitude of the American industrial machine. Ice cream and Coca-Cola, though trivial in the grand scheme of war, were tangible representations of the vast logistical network that the United States had in place to support its war effort. The Germans had been conditioned to believe that the United States' strength lay solely in its industrial output of war materials, tanks, planes, and ships. But the reality of America's resources went beyond the battlefield. The country's ability to produce and supply an endless variety of goods, from food to drinks to luxuries, was unlike anything the Germans had ever seen. The psychological impact of these experiences was profound. The German soldiers, who had entered captivity with a sense of superiority, began to question everything they had been taught about the United States. These luxuries, which seemed so trivial, were in fact a shock to the system. They revealed that the United States was not simply an industrial power. It was a nation that could afford to provide for its people, and even its prisoners, in ways that no other country could. It was a revelation that shook the prisoners to their core, forcing them to confront the truth. The United States was not just a rising power, it was already a superpower, capable of mobilizing its resources on a scale that Germany could never hope to match. For many of the prisoners, the shock went beyond the luxuries they encountered. It was the realization that the U.S. had not just been a silent participant in the war, but had been preparing for it long before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The Americans had transformed their entire economy into a war machine in a matter of months. The Germans, who had been locked in the mindset of their own nationalistic and ideological superiority, were beginning to see that the United States was not just a formidable adversary. It was a country whose very way of life, its industrial capacity, and its logistical systems were unparalleled. These small comforts, ice cream and Coca-Cola, served as the gateway to a deeper understanding. As the POWs sat in American prison camps, sipping on their cold drinks and enjoying their ice cream, they couldn't help but realize the magnitude of what they had been up against. The United States had not just won the war with military might, it had done so with its unmatched ability to produce, to organize, and to distribute resources on a scale that no one had ever dreamed possible. And in the most unexpected of ways, the simple indulgence of ice cream and Coca-Cola had become the key to understanding America's true power. By the time the war came to a close, the German prisoners who had tasted these luxuries and witnessed the scale of American production had undergone a transformation. The myths they had been taught about the United States had been shattered, replaced by a newfound respect for the true strength of the American war machine. Ice cream and Coca-Cola, simple comforts in the grand scheme of things, had become potent symbols of the industrial might that had powered the American victory. And for the German POWs, they would forever serve as reminders of how their own assumptions had been crushed by the overwhelming reality of America's strength. For the German prisoners of war, the realization that the United States possessed an industrial and technological capacity far beyond anything they had imagined was a gradual one. The POWs had come to America expecting to see a country struggling to keep up with the war effort, a nation whose logistical challenges would eventually undermine its power. Instead, what they encountered was a world of ingenuity and innovation, where seemingly small, even insignificant inventions had a profound impact on the battlefield. The DUKW, a versatile amphibious vehicle, would become one of the most stunning examples of American ingenuity, an invention that would both defy the prisoners' expectations and help turn the tide of the war in the Allies' favor. The DUKW, a truck that could operate both on land and water, was the brainchild of American engineers who sought to address one of the most critical logistical challenges of the war: how to quickly move troops, supplies, and equipment across bodies of water, including rivers, beaches, and flooded terrain. The Germans, accustomed to relying on traditional methods of transportation, tanks, trucks, and boats, were at first incredulous when they saw the DUKW in action. It seemed, to their minds, an absurd concept. How could a vehicle designed to drive on land also navigate the water with any efficiency? It was, in their view, yet another example of what they had come to see as the American tendency to overcomplicate things, to create machines and systems that appeared far too intricate to be effective. The German soldiers, who had grown accustomed to the relatively straightforward methods of warfare, were skeptical of any innovation that didn't conform to the established norms of combat. The idea of a vehicle that could drive onto a beach, traverse flooded fields, and cross rivers while still functioning as a reliable transport vehicle seemed, to them, impossible. It was a concept that ran contrary to everything they knew about military vehicles, especially when they were accustomed to the heavy tanks and specialized landing crafts used in amphibious assaults. The DUKW, a combination of a military truck and a boat, defied not only their technical understanding, but their perceptions of what warfare could be. What the Germans failed to understand was the sheer brilliance behind the DUKW's design. The vehicle's name itself, a combination of letters that stood for D for duplex drive, meaning dual purpose, U for utility, K for truck, and W for wheel, was a reflection of the creativity that went into its development. Built to carry a payload of up to 2.5 tons, the DUKW could travel at speeds of up to 5 mph in water and 35 mph on land. Its ability to seamlessly transition between the two environments gave the Allies an unprecedented level of mobility, allowing them to move supplies directly from ships to shore, bypassing the need for specialized landing crafts and overcoming the challenges posed by difficult terrain. The DUKW was deployed in numerous key operations during the war, with one of its most notable uses being during the Allied invasion of Normandy on D-Day. On June 6, 1944, as thousands of soldiers stormed the beaches of France, the DUKWs rolled off landing ships and drove straight onto the sand, their wheels churning up the surf as they carried soldiers, weapons, and equipment to the front lines. For the German prisoners, witnessing this display was a moment of realization. The DUKWs didn't just provide logistical support, they were an integral part of the success of the invasion. Without these amphibious vehicles, the Allied forces would have struggled to move the sheer volume of supplies and reinforcements needed to sustain the beachhead. In the months that followed, the POWs saw more examples of how the DUKW transformed the way the war was fought. These vehicles weren't just limited to beach landings. They were used in a variety of scenarios, from crossing rivers to navigating flooded roads in the wake of bombings and natural disasters. In the European theater, where rivers like the Rhine and the Elbe were often the final barriers between advancing forces and victory, the DUKWs proved invaluable. The Germans, who had long relied on their own engineering prowess, had never conceived of a solution like this. The ability to cross rivers, deliver supplies, and evacuate casualties all with a single vehicle was a game-changer. But the real impact of the DUKW on the German POWs went beyond its practical application on the battlefield. To them, the DUKW was a symbol of something far more profound: the American ability to adapt, innovate, and overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. The Germans had underestimated the United States not only in terms of its manufacturing capacity, but also in its creative solutions to logistical problems. The DUKW was not just a tool of war. It was a testament to the American mindset that embraced ingenuity, experimentation, and practicality in ways the Axis powers could never match. For the German soldiers, watching the DUKWs in action was a humbling experience. These were men who had fought with the most advanced tanks and weapons of their time, who had believed that technological superiority would decide the outcome of the war. They had been told that German engineering was the pinnacle of military innovation. Yet here they were, witnessing a machine that seemed so simple, so unassuming, yet capable of achieving what no single German vehicle could: traversing both land and water with ease, overcoming the very obstacles that had been considered natural barriers in warfare. The Germans, who had never thought to combine the capabilities of a truck and a boat, found themselves forced to reevaluate their own understanding of military innovation. They had failed to grasp the true scope of American ingenuity. The DUKW in many ways encapsulated the nature of the American war effort. It wasn't about creating the most complex or advanced technology. It was about finding practical solutions to real-world problems. The DUKW wasn't a weapon of mass destruction. It was a vehicle of mobility and efficiency. It was designed not for destruction, but for the logistical support that would enable victory. In a war that was often defined by brute force and firepower, The DUKW was a reminder that the true key to success lay in the ability to adapt, to innovate, and to mobilize. As the German prisoners spent more time in captivity, they came to understand that the DUKW was just one example of the many small, seemingly insignificant innovations that had allowed the United States to outpace the Axis powers in almost every aspect of the war. The Germans had failed to appreciate the depth of American ingenuity, assuming that their own methods were the best and only way to fight a war. But the DUKW, along with countless other innovations, showed them that the United States was not only capable of creating powerful weapons, it was capable of thinking outside the box, of coming up with solutions that could shift the course of battle. In the end, the DUKW was more than just a vehicle. It was a lesson. For the German POWs, it was the moment they realized how deeply they had misjudged the United States. What they had once thought of as a country lacking in military sophistication was, in fact, a nation capable of transforming war logistics and engineering with a single vehicle. And this, more than anything else, was a clear signal that the United States was a force that could not be underestimated. The DUKW, like so many other American innovations, crossed not just rivers and beaches, it crossed expectations, leaving the German prisoners to confront the overwhelming reality of American power. As the war dragged on, a palpable shift began to take place within the ranks of the Axis powers. The initial overconfidence that had propelled Germany and its allies into battle, convinced of their superiority on land, sea, and air, began to erode in the face of an overwhelming and relentless adversary. The United States, which had once been dismissed as a distant and disorganized power, had now fully mobilized its industrial might. Tanks, planes, ships, and vehicles, seemingly endless quantities of these war machines, were flooding into the battlefield at a rate that no one had anticipated. The Germans, once sure of their own technological and military dominance, found themselves staring at a new reality. The war was no longer about superior strategy or innovative weaponry. It was about mass production. And in this realm, the United States was an unstoppable force. For the German commanders, the turning point came when they realized they were fighting a war they could never win, not because of any single battle or defeat, but because of a fundamental miscalculation. They had underestimated the scale of America's ability to produce, sustain, and innovate. Early in the war, they had assumed that the United States could not possibly keep up with the demand for weapons, vehicles, and ships. The Germans believed that the logistical challenges of transportation, the time required to retool civilian factories for war production, and the sheer size of the country would hamper America's efforts to become a true military power. In the end, it was this misjudgment that led to their downfall. By 1943, the numbers were undeniable. The U.S. had already surpassed German production in several key areas, and the gap was only widening. Where Germany was limited by its own manufacturing base, the United States was churning out massive quantities of war material. Aircraft production skyrocketed, with American factories like those at Willow Run, Consolidated Aircraft, and others producing bombers at an astonishing rate. The B-24 Liberator, for example, became the backbone of the Allied bombing campaign, with the U.S. cranking out hundreds each month. Germany, despite its impressive engineering prowess, could not match this kind of output. The American industrial machine had gone into overdrive, and the Germans were powerless to stop it. It wasn't just the quantity of war material that shocked the Germans. It was the sheer variety and sophistication of the equipment being produced. Tanks, jeeps, trucks, rifles, ammunition, and even the famous DUKW amphibious vehicles were being manufactured in staggering numbers. The U.S. had become a true industrial war machine, capable of equipping millions of soldiers with cutting-edge equipment and moving those resources across the globe to every theater of war. On the other hand, Germany was stretched thin, struggling to maintain production lines and facing constant bombing raids that crippled its ability to produce war material. The disparity was clear. The Axis powers were fighting against a country whose industrial power seemed limitless. The German High Command, which had once dismissed the idea of American military might, began to realize the gravity of the situation. Hitler, Göring, and the other leaders had been convinced that the United States was an industrial powerhouse that would eventually falter. But now, they could see that America's production capabilities were not just a temporary advantage. They were the backbone of the war effort. Each new shipment of U.S. tanks, planes, and trucks was a reminder that the Allies had the upper hand and that the Axis was fighting a war of attrition that they could never win. The realization began to sink in that Germany's military might, which had once seemed so superior, was not enough to counter the vast scale of American production. German commanders who had once believed they could win through superior tactics were now confronted with the fact that the United States could outproduce them on every front. The Germans had poured all of their resources into high-tech weapons like the V-2 rocket, the Tiger tank, and the U-boat fleet. But these innovations, no matter how impressive, could not match the sheer volume of Allied war material being produced. The U.S. wasn't just outproducing them. It was outclassing them in terms of versatility and adaptability. American factories didn't just build tanks, they built a full spectrum of weapons for every need, from fighter planes to anti-aircraft guns, and every type of vehicle required to wage war. What compounded the Germans' desperation was the realization that America's logistical capabilities were equally impressive. The Allies could move massive amounts of material across the Atlantic, across the Pacific, and onto the battlefield with efficiency and speed. The Germans, on the other hand, were shackled by the limitations of their transportation networks, which were constantly under threat from Allied bombers and guerrilla attacks. The vast distances they had to cover, the sheer volume of material required to sustain their war effort, and the lack of reliable transportation all worked against them. The American ability to rapidly deploy troops and supplies via their vast fleet of transport ships, trucks, and even amphibious vehicles like the DUKW meant that no matter how hard the Germans fought, they could never outpace their adversaries. The psychological toll on the German leadership was profound. What had started as a confident belief in their own superiority began to crumble as they watched the Allies steadily gain ground. Not through tactical brilliance or technological wonders, but through sheer production power. The Germans were forced to acknowledge that they were losing the war, not because their generals weren't skilled, but because they had misjudged the fundamental nature of modern warfare. The key to victory, it turned out, was not in the most advanced weapon, but in the ability to produce weapons, to keep the supply lines open, and to maintain a constant flow of reinforcements and materials. By 1944, the Axis powers had no choice but to confront the full scale of America's industrial power. The realization came too late. Even as the Germans scrambled to build their own war machines, they were already facing the consequences of their strategic miscalculations. As the Allies landed in Normandy and advanced across Europe, the Germans could no longer ignore the fact that they were fighting against a force that could replace every tank, every plane, every ship lost in battle, and at a pace that Germany could never hope to match. The turning point came in the final months of 1944, as the Allies launched Operation Market Garden and the Battle of the Bulge. These offensives, combined with the constant barrage of bombing raids that targeted German factories and supply lines, marked the beginning of the end. By the time Allied forces crossed the Rhine and advanced into Germany, the Germans knew they had already lost the war. They had failed to adapt to the realities of modern warfare. Their armies, once the pride of Europe, were being overwhelmed not by superior tactics, but by superior industrial power. The German command had been so focused on the battlefield that they had failed to see the bigger picture. That in this war, the ability to produce and sustain military forces was just as important as the ability to fight. In the final analysis, the Axis powers had been undone by the very thing they had underestimated most: the ability of the United States to mobilize its economy, to innovate on a scale never before seen, and to produce weapons and materials in quantities that no nation could match. The Germans, once confident in their ability to conquer the world, were now confronted with the harsh reality that they had misjudged the strength of their enemies. And it was this misjudgment, this failure to understand the true nature of American power, that would ultimately lead to their defeat. The confidence that had fueled the Axis powers in the early years of the war had crumbled by 1944, replaced by a grim awareness of their inevitable failure. The German commanders knew they were fighting a war they could never win, one in which industrial production, not military strategy, would determine the outcome. And by the time they realized this truth, it was already too late. As the war in Europe drew to a close and the world began to assess what had happened, it became clear that the ultimate force behind the Allied victory was not simply the firepower of their weapons, the brilliance of their strategies, or the courage of their soldiers. It was something far more subtle, yet profoundly powerful: the unspoken force of American industrial capability. The Axis powers had been defeated not just by bombs and bullets, but by the relentless, overwhelming tide of American production, logistics, and ingenuity. It was this force that had turned the tide of the war and made victory inevitable. For the German commanders, the realization came too late. They had failed to understand that the key to defeating them lay not in the superior tactical prowess of their generals or the advanced technology of their weapons, but in the sheer scale of American industrial output. While Germany focused on precision, perfection, and innovation in their designs, the United States focused on something more fundamental: abundance. The ability to produce weapons and supplies in staggering quantities to outpace the enemy in terms of sheer output was a strategy the Axis could not comprehend and could never hope to match. From tanks to planes, to ships, to the smallest amphibious vehicle, every aspect of the American war effort was driven by the power of production. The United States didn't just build weapons for the front lines, it built an entire ecosystem of support, from the assembly lines that churned out vehicles and planes to the vast networks of logistics that ensured those materials reached their destinations. It was an industrial war, and the United States was the undisputed champion. The German army, stretched thin on all fronts, was overwhelmed not by the superior firepower of its enemies, but by the sheer weight of American production. This was the game changer. The German soldiers who once scoffed at the idea of American victory had become prisoners of war, watching in disbelief as the U.S. churned out more tanks, more planes, more ammunition, and more supplies than they could ever hope to counter. The DUKWs, the B-24 Liberators, the endless stream of trucks and jeeps. These were not just vehicles. They were symbols of a nation's ability to mobilize, to adapt, and to innovate on a scale that no one else could match. It was this unrelenting flow of resources, of everything a modern war needed, that turned the tide in favor of the Allies. It wasn't just about fighting battles, it was about sustaining them. The American ability to outproduce, to keep the factories running 24/7, to keep the supply lines flowing, was a force of nature. It wasn't flashy, it didn't draw the headlines, but it was the foundation of everything that happened on the battlefield. Without that vast industrial engine humming away in the background, none of the victories would have been possible. It was the trucks and the tanks, the planes and the ships, the supplies that kept soldiers fed and equipped. That made the difference. The Axis, by contrast, failed to see the true importance of logistics. They believed that technology and strategy would win the war. They believed that superior designs and innovation would carry the day. But the Germans and the Japanese were fighting against an enemy whose very existence was a testament to the power of production. When the war began, the United States was still transforming its civilian economy into a war machine. But by the time the first shots were fired, that transformation was complete. The Germans couldn't understand it. They couldn't fathom that the United States could build so many weapons so quickly, so efficiently. Their assumptions were based on a worldview where technology and precision ruled, not on one where sheer quantity and industrial might could decide the outcome of the war. And this is where American ingenuity played its most significant role. It wasn't just about making more of the same. It was about reimagining what was possible. The United States took its industrial base and turned it into a war-winning force by constantly innovating and adapting. The DUKW, an amphibious vehicle that could traverse both land and water, was just one example of how American engineers thought outside the box to solve problems that had been insurmountable for other nations. The B-24 Liberator, a bomber that could be produced at a rate faster than any comparable aircraft in the world, was another example of American ingenuity. These weren't just technological marvels. They were examples of how the United States could take a problem and, with its unparalleled industrial resources, find a solution that nobody else could match. The true weapon of the United States, then, was not just its ability to fight, it was its ability to keep fighting, no matter how many planes were shot down, how many tanks were destroyed, or how many battles were lost. It was the power of production, the ability to turn out more war material, to outlast the enemy, and to maintain the logistical infrastructure that would sustain victory. As the Germans and the Japanese continued to struggle, trying to maintain their own fragile supply lines, the United States kept moving forward, replenishing its forces faster than the Axis could possibly keep up. In the end, it wasn't the American army that defeated the Axis, it was the American industrial machine. It was the factories, the workers, the engineers, and the logistical experts who ensured that the soldiers on the front lines always had what they needed, when they needed it. It was the unseen, unsung heroes of production that made the difference, and they turned the tide of war in a way that no one, not even the Axis, could have predicted. As we reflect on the outcome of the war, it becomes clear that the true power of the United States lay not in its weapons or its soldiers, but in its ability to produce them faster, more efficiently, and on a greater scale than any other nation in history. It was this power, this ability to create abundance where others saw scarcity, that changed the course of the war and ultimately led to the defeat of the Axis powers. The impact of American industrial might is still felt today, as the legacy of this ingenuity continues to shape the world in countless ways. The war ended not with a single decisive battle, but with the overwhelming weight of American production and logistics. The Germans and the Japanese fought with valor and skill, but in the end they were outproduced, outlasted, and outmuscled by the American industrial machine. It was the power of abundance, the unspoken force of logistics and production, that sealed their fate. And this, more than any weapon or battle, was the true weapon that defeated the Axis.